Morning and welcome to the Pirates Fan Forum here on DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcast Network. I'm your host Gary Morgan. With me as always is my good friend and co-host Jim Stamm. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, man. I see a familiar face on the screen right now.
Yeah, we're gonna welcome back to the show Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News, and famed baseball coverage is not in his description. He's more about basketball recently. But he's written a story on the 30-year anniversary of the 1992 Game 7 loss to the Atlanta Braves, and we thought it was a good time to have him on. And Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, guys. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I really enjoy your work and your company, and so it's really nice that you had me back.
Even if we're going to have to talk about something really painful, and but maybe it'll be a little cathartic at the same time. So. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Super happy to have you back, but we are going to push that off a little bit. We're going to talk about something happy first, because it's also the anniversary of Bill Mazeroski hitting that game-winning home run in 1960. And, obviously I don't have firsthand experience of it, but I do have hand-me-down stories from my grandpa about working in the mill and his boss that never ever gave them a break on anything, let everybody out to go party in the streets the second that home run cleared the wall. So I thought, let's take a moment and take advantage of having somebody who's actually spoken to Bill Mazeroski on the show. What does it mean to the city and the game itself, that home run, and what'd you have as far as talking to Bill Mazeroski?
Well, I think it sort of illustrates in a lot of ways the history of baseball in one moment, because it is by far the greatest moment in the history of the game. It was the first, and I believe still the only. It was the first home run that won a series, and I believe it's still the only that won a series in the seventh game. And yet you can't get people to say that's the biggest moment, because goodness gracious, the Giants won the pennant, right, in 51. And so that's got to be bigger, even though they went out and lost the series, still bigger, because it was New York. And that kind of defines baseball, because whatever happens in New York is what matters most. And what happens to New York, thanks, Maz, doesn't matter most. That moment was...
That was the true to the shot heard around the world, the Mazeroski home run, and because that's what they refer to as the Robbie Thompson one, and that's not fair.
No, I mean, obviously it was a special moment in 51, and it's there have been stories since. Wall Street Journal did a piece many years later about the stealing signs that went on in that series. It maybe colored it a little bit, but. At the end of the day, it was a National League one-game playoff for a pennant, and as I said, the Giants did not go out then and win the World Series. So it was cool that they got to the series, and I'll tell you, when we get to our second subject, I mean, just making the series in '92 would have really been something. But again, to win the World Series on a home run, especially in a game like that, 10-9. Lead going back and forth, crazy stuff happening all over the field. All of that. It was the greatest baseball game ever played, and it ended in the greatest moment in the history of the game, and it doesn't get celebrated nationally enough. I know that Pittsburgh does a wonderful job of embracing that moment with the little almost church service they have every year on this day, and
which is so cool.
That is a absolute bucket list item for me. I didn't, for most of the time I lived in Pittsburgh, I didn't really know about it. I'm not sure when I learned of it, but I know it was toward the end of my time in Pittsburgh. And of course, being away all this time since 1992, 93, I haven't had the opportunity to be back for it. But I'm going to get there one of these days soon and be a part of that. So Pittsburgh does a great job with it. And, Maz himself, it happened that the 1 year I spent covering the Pirates on a regular basis, I did it for the Greensburg Tribune Review and what was then called the Daily Tribune, which was based in Monroeville and leaning toward the eastern suburbs with a little bit of downtown flair, which is why I covered 135 games in 1982. And for that, I was Maz's local paper because he lived in Hempfield at that time. I'm not sure if he still does, but he did then. And so he saw my stuff, and so I got to meet him at Old Timers game and talk to him. And down at spring training that year, same thing. And I mean, he is just, of all the people, if you could pick one player in the history of baseball to allow to hit the biggest home run that ever was hit, he's the guy you would want to hit it because he is the sweetest human being that you could ask to meet and most, kindest and most humble. I mean, there were a lot of people who were very strongly in favor of his Hall of Fame induction. And there were just as many maybe that were ardently against it.
Right.
Because his batting statistics didn't measure up to some people, and it always makes me laugh because I'm like, hey man, I saw Ozzie Smith, and Ozzie Smith was unbelievable at shortstop, unbelievable, but he didn't exactly hit the ball a lot. And so if that, why is it that on one side of second base, like you can become a Hall of Famer catching ground balls, but on the other side you can't? I mean, I always thought that was ridiculous. So it was really cool to see him get up there and show everybody how much it meant to him and how humble he was. And every year on this day, we get to celebrate what he did.
I mean, it's funny when I go down.
For a franchise that hasn't won much in the last 30, 40 years, we sure have some historical moments and players, though. Jim, what were you going to say, brother?
I was just going to say, every time I go down to the stadium and to PNC Park, and we typically park on that side of things where the Maz statue is. And, every time I walk by it, I still think of it, even though I wasn't alive at the time or anything. I take a minute and think about it because, it's so iconic, and I do wish that nationally it was celebrated a little bit more. Mike, was there anything that he ever said about that moment, or that you asked him specifically that he, anything that stood out to you over the years with him? Or
honestly, when I had my longest conversation with him was after an Old Timers game, and it happened that he brought the glove that he wore as a player. And it was and I don't know that he ever changed it. I mean, he wasn't one of those guys that was changing. And I believe it is, as I recall, it's been 40 years, but it had like a hole in the palm of the glove. I mean, and he brought it to the Old Timers game, and he's still scooping up grounders. And, he was still a reasonably young man. I think he was younger then. When much younger than when we talked than I am now. So, but it was still cool to see him out there with that glove that had that was so worn out. But if people don't really understand, go look up Maz's defensive stats.
Yeah, they're incredible.
They're easy to find. Baseball Reference, it's easy to find, and then compare him to any other second baseman that ever played. I mean, there is, just as Ozzie was off the charts as a defensive shortstop, that's Maz on the other side of second base. I'm telling you, the stats are ridiculous. The number of double plays, the number of chances. He was unbelievable. It's not appreciated enough how genuinely great. Now, no one can pretend that he was a great hitter. He was a decent hitter. But he was so good on the defensive side that he was a worthy Hall of Famer. And of course, he had more than once some big hits, some special hits. He popped the ball out of the park from time to time, just not on a power hitter level.
I met the man one time at spring training, probably 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm not an autograph person, but I had a hat. And he was talking to me. I was holding my hat in my hand, and he had a marker, and I kind of just gave it to him. and he signed it. And he looked up at me. I'll never forget, because this dude has no business like doing this at all. Looks up at me and goes, "Thank you." Thanks me for asking him for his, like,
Yeah.
I mean, just the most humble man, and yeah, beautiful human being. And with that, we should take a break and enjoy that good feeling, folks, because it's not going to last when we get into the next segment. Now, hold up. All right, welcome back to the Pirates Fan Forum here on DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcast Network. Gary, Jim, and Mike DeCourcy with you today. And we're going to go back and visit a painful time in Pirates history. I know, don't mean not last Tuesday. I mean, October 14th.
Which one, Gary?
1992. The Game 7 loss to the Atlanta Braves. So, Mike, it's the 30-year anniversary. I'm sure you're not the only one that's going to write about this. In fact, I already saw Tim Benz wrote about it today, too. So,
no, Mike's will just be better. That's all right.
Oh, no,
well,
I will say
that's a given.
Tim's is very. Yeah, he's done 2 parts already. It's very good. I took a little bit different approach than he did. He got Jim Leland. He got. I'm trying to think who else he had. He got Van Slyke, a few other players. Lloyd McClendon. He got. My approach was a little bit more oriented toward the how it affected everybody, and in part because I thought about putting myself into the story, because my 1992 Game 7 story, I think, is as sad as anybody that didn't play in the game, because I had been a lifelong Pittsburgher to that point and had just moved into a house that my wife and I, in the North Hills, my wife and I had decided, we were going to live there for the rest of our lives, basically. And then early May, the Teamsters go on strike against the Pittsburgh Press. And early October, Scripps Howard says, "That's it, we're done. We're selling the paper. We're out." And I knew on the night that game was being played that there was a 90% chance, maybe a little bit less than that I was leaving Pittsburgh at the end of the year, once the paper got sold and closed and all that. And so I wanted one last World Series in my town before I left. And my father had passed away in 1990. And so my wife and I said, we're taking your dad to the World Series. And so each year, 90, 91, 92, we bought World Series tickets, and we always gave them back because never got to use them. So I'm sitting there watching that game, and they're up 2-0. And I'm thinking, okay, I did not care at that point. As Doug Drabeck took the mound, I would not have cared one bit if they got swept in 4 games by the Blue Jays. Not at all. It wasn't about that. It was about going to the series in Pittsburgh. It was about taking my father-in-law. It was about having that to share with my wife and doing all that before I had to leave in exile. And so that, watching that dissolve in however long that took, one thing I didn't do was go back and look at how, was that 3 minutes or 3 hours? Because it was horrifying. And so I don't know how long it took.
Where you start. Yeah. Do you start with Chico booting a ball, or do you start with Pendleton knocking one in front of, the brand new inserted right fielder who, maybe got a bad jump on the ball? It's really difficult to say when it started.
Yeah, I look at it. I look at that as kind of a bad luck, because Drabeck's pitch wasn't bad. I went back and watched the 9th, and in writing my piece, which appears today, I went back and looked at it, and it was a good pitch, and Pendleton just fought it, and as Mike LaValliere said in our article, 95 times out of 100, that ball's going to curl foul, and then you go back out and try to strike him out or whatever. And that time it just hung up and stayed straight. And I don't know whether, a great right fielder might have caught it, but I don't know that the Pirates of that era had a great right fielder.
No.
I mean, even if Bobby had stayed, Bobby Bonilla had stayed, I don't think that he would have been. He might have, but I don't think he would have been expected to.
Yeah, I don't think it was a play that someone makes that's not a pretty darn good fielder. So it's hard to get hung up on that.
I thought it was interesting. Lloyd McClendon definitely thought he could have gotten it.
Yeah.
And I think that, looking back, I don't think so. In fact, until I read that today in the Tim Benn story, I didn't ever even consider that anybody could have caught that ball. So, it was, to me, right over my head. I had no belief whatsoever that anybody should have caught that. It really all started with Chico for me and kind of went downhill from there. But man, what a painful loss. It's ranked by many people as the 4th best game ever played. We just talked about what we consider the best ever. But I mean, it had some historical things in it, man. Like, it was the first game to ever end that way. Cabrera's hit gave the Braves the pennant. It was the first time that a team was 1 out away from losing in a winner-take-all situation, but won the game's final pitch.
Yeah, Tim Kurchian did the SI story at the time, and as I was researching this piece, I found that out. I was not aware of that at the time.
Well, I stole this from Jason Foster on your site. So. Okay,
there you go. So I wasn't aware of that, and I will be honest with you. I and this is no bias whatsoever. It was an exciting ending for those who didn't care who won or for the Braves, but I don't know that it was one of the greatest games ever played. I have a hard time with that because there were base running mistakes. It was decided on an error and a couple of walks. I'm not sure that adds up to the greatest baseball game ever. I mean, the game that's Pirates-Yankees 60 game was amazing. There were games in the 79 series and the 71 series that off the top of my head were better games. I think if you think back on Game 6 of the Reds-Pirates series when Carmelo Martinez hit the ball to the wall and scraped it off, that probably was a better game in a lot of ways. Again, it didn't end the way we might have preferred it to, but I think it was probably a better game. This was a dramatic ending, and sometimes people construe that to mean it was a great game. I argue with people all the time about the NCAA tournament 2005. Illinois came back from 13-14 down in the final 3 minutes to force overtime and went on to win, went on to the Final Four. Great game ever played? No. They were awful for 35 minutes. And then they did a great job for 8 or 9. So, no, I mean, I think that the great games are the ones that go back and forth all along, and great baseball's played, and then somebody just ends up winning because they made the last great play.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think a lot of people forget that, the Braves were leading this series 3-1.
Yes.
It took some excellent pitching performances from this team just to be in that Game 7 to begin with. Bob Walk goes complete game, throws like 128 pitches. Tim Wakefield comes in and goes complete game. Drabek nearly makes it a three-peat on complete games in a playoff series. Boy, you could not see that in today's game. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, if you watched that game now as a replay, which I don't know what person from Pittsburgh would, but if you did, the game would be seen. It would be so different, wouldn't it be? I mean, it would be like watching Twilight Zone baseball compared to what we see today, on so many levels with the pitching the way it is and the defense, and there's not the shifting that was going on. So it just would have been. It would just be interesting from that. I'm not going to do it. I never will. I'm just saying, but it would be interesting to see that.
There was just enough. Yeah. There was just enough shifting, Jim, that Jay Bell was up toward the second base a little bit so that ball went straight through. That Francisco Cabrera hit. It went straight through into left field. I do think that if you looked at that game, if you looked at that ninth inning, you'll see that it is different. And I think one of the things that was different was that in today's baseball, you would have had, especially on a team as great as that Pirates team was, you would have had an established closer.
I knew that's where you were going. Yep.
Yeah, Stan Belinda was trying to grow into the role, and I did an extensive piece about him trying to do that for the press in the summer of '91, and he still hadn't totally made it. I mean, you go back and look, and he was our closer, and I believe when I looked, and the number was 18 saves on a 90-plus win, and I think they won 96 that year, and they had 18 saves, if I'm right about that. So it just wasn't the same, and you would have had more bullpen arms that you trusted as well. Because the one thing that always bothered me about that game, and it stuck with me, and Tim's story kind of addressed it a little bit, part two, where he said that Bob Walk's arm was on fire after having won Game 5 and thrown 100-plus pitches. And I always felt that after Belinda comes in, and he gets the Gant fly out to left that looks like a grand slam but falls short, and then he walks Barry Hill. I should say walks. See the air quotes if you're listening audio. I'm doing air quotes because he walked him, and then he gets the pop up that Lean fields, and it's 2 outs. I felt at that point he'd gotten 3 outs, and he had no more outs in him. And if there was another arm out there that you trusted, that it would have been better to bring that player in. I didn't think Stan had 4 outs in him. And I thought, and Walk was warming up, and I thought, why not? And my thoughts, that it might have been that he was a little bit wild pitch prone, and wouldn't it be awful to tie the game or whatever on a wild pitch? But I think that the answer must have been that he just wasn't sharp because he'd pitched so much in Game 5. I haven't read part 3 of Tim's piece, and he only raised that parenthetically. It felt like there was going to be maybe some more, and maybe there will be in part 3. But that allusion to the arm being on fire, sort of made me feel a little bit better 30 years later that Leyland didn't really have great options.
Yeah, and it's funny because you don't think about that as you're watching the season progress, because their starting pitching was so good. I mean, it went deep all the time. And we just talked about the ramp up from down 3-1 to actually be in Game 7, took consecutive back-to-back complete games. That bullpen should have been beyond rested.
Yeah.
That tells you how untrustworthy most of the options really were. And
how things were built back then a little bit.
Well, really, too, we were right there on the edge, right at the beginning of money starting to really make a difference in baseball, too. That was a place where the Pirates started to fall short, right there. And the year before, they had lost a couple stars. And, you had seen the wheels start to come off. I actually didn't even expect them to go back to this point in 92. So I was a little bit, wishful thinking already going into it. And, I know Mike, when he talked to me about the story he was going to write, I told him, I told my kids, this is when I matured as a baseball fan. It's when I really realized, okay, this is a business too, and things are going to start falling apart now. And so this game is more than a game. It was a delineation mark for this franchise. Really, for all of Major League Baseball. Because the Yankees, with their massive payrolls fueled by it, in 1998, they signed I believe it was a 12-year deal for almost $50 million a year. It doesn't seem like a lot now, but it was a ton then. For almost $50 million a year. Here recently. So. Yeah. And so they signed it in 88, and it was going to go into force. And maybe it did in 92, maybe 93, somewhere in there. And so that changed the game already, right at that moment. My colleague at the press at the time,
the late Scott Newman, was the one who said to me, "Hey, this is the first shot. This is them coming over the walls. It's never going to be the same after this happens." Yep. And then, of course, the Pirates were able to, because that money wasn't kicking in quite yet, and the Pirates were able to, complete the rebuilding process that Sid Thrift had begun with Jim Leland and that Bonilla, Bonds, Van Slyke group, and get those 3 divisions. And it wasn't money. Maybe it was in '92 because they let Sid Bream go in '90, and they let Bonilla walk in '91, and they traded John Smiley, a 20-game winner. Not my favorite Pirate all time, but still a 20-game winner.
Sure.
And they did all that, and they made minor moves to deepen what they had left. I remember them bringing in Danny Jackson late in the '92 season, for example, but they didn't do a ton. It sure would have been nice to have another bullpen arm, obviously. And
that's what Jackson turned into anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that from that point on, from '92 on, when Bonds goes to San Francisco for $5 million a year or whatever it was, and then the Yankees start buying up everybody. And of course the Braves. People don't realize at the time the Braves, because of the Superstation, had a lot more revenue rolling through their club than the average team as well.
That's a really good point.
All that is really when the game changed to what it is now.
I think people forget even what a coup it was for them to sign Terry Pendleton. At the time, he was a big St. Louis Cardinals star. To have him leave Ozzie Smith and the whole machine that was going on in St. Louis, that sort of stuff didn't happen. Like that's really kind of the beginning. The early 90s, late 80s is when you really started to see some of this stuff, and these bigger teams that could afford it started buying some of their stars. And that's just not how baseball was. So definitely a line in the sand right there to me. It's kind of when I grew up and when I died at the same time.
Well, and we knew the writing was on the wall, right? I mean, you just kind of
we all
figured
knew Barry was gone.
Barry, that's where I was going. We knew Bonds. We knew Bonds was leaving, and that was going to fundamentally change things right there, because people only, I think, especially a little bit of the younger crowd, I think they think of Barry Bonds as just this first half career of Barry Bonds and second half career of Barry Bonds. Different player entirely. Both great, and great as great can be, but very different ball players. And he was so special, and I just the fact that they weren't going to have him was really going to
the same. In this very game we're talking about, got intentionally walked twice. I mean, it's not like that changed for him. It's Barry Bonds was a special player, and just knowing that you were going to lose him, and not because you didn't want him, was just a different experience as a baseball fan.
One of the things that was interesting, Gare, about what I learned in doing this article was, first of all, that Bream desperately wanted to stay. Desperately. He and his wife cried when the Pirates said they were out. And the Pirates had initially told everybody publicly that signing him was their number one priority, and then they basically never made a competitive offer. And then after he talked to the Braves and they said, here's what the number is, and we didn't talk about what the number was, but here's what the number is, and he said, okay. And then that night, he and his wife cried because they were going to have to leave Pittsburgh. They love it so much, they're still there.
Even
though he takes a little guff from time to time.
Gary, how much time we got before we got to get a break? Because I want to get into.
Go ahead, man.
I want to get into some of the Sid Bream stuff, because I was fortunate enough when Sid was at the end of his career, and I was in my freshman year in college. He was good friends with our head coach, and he had just signed at the end of his career. He had just signed a deal with the Houston Astros for a year. But he wanted to get some work in before he headed down to spring training, and we were still playing at this time of the year. So he asked to come work out with us. Well, as it just so happens, I happen to be a first baseman. So me and Sid Bream got to share first base duties for about 2 weeks. And, really, really one of the highlights of my playing career. And, poor Sid Bream, because if there was a question to be asked, I asked it, right? And I'm talking everything from on the field with what I was trying to be at that point in time, which was nowhere near that kind of caliber of player, but you're picking their brains constantly, right? So, but then, of course, I was going to ask him about some of this stuff with the Game 7 and everything, right? He helped. By the way, you want to talk about a good guy? He stayed afterwards with me and helped me work on hitting lefties, and just everything I asked him to do, he would do it. And he would ask me at first base, "Do you want to jump in on this? Can I jump in on this rep?" I'm like, "Sid, you can do whatever you want, man. I'm hanging out with you, buddy." And so that is the kind of guy he was. Super nice guy, super humble. But
so fair to say you've forgiven him, unlike most of the city.
I have, man. Like, I know people here, can't stand the name, but Mike touched on it. I asked him about him leaving, and he was very, very adamant about the fact that they never wanted to leave. He felt hurt by it. There were some hurt feelings over that, and as a competitor, he said it did feel good, though, what happened in that Game 7 when he scored that run. Just in the sense of like, hey, as a player, when someone tells you you're not important enough to stay around and you can somehow come back and make that team pay for that. And that stood out to me because I thought, hey, these guys are competitors, man. And he was very much, not conceited about it, but saying, hey, you know what, that felt good to be able to do that to a former team that didn't necessarily want me anymore.
If anybody gets anything out of this podcast other than our stories, like, let Sid Bream, let that go. I mean, those guys were doing their jobs. Like Jacob Trouba, you want to be mad at Jacob Trouba? Go ahead, because he's not doing the right thing. But a guy who goes out and plays hard and plays clean and does the right things, if he beats your team, even if it's as many times as Tom Brady has, like that, that's a totally different thing. Even before I got a chance to talk to Francisco Cabrera and Sid Bream for this article, I never held anything against them. They're doing their jobs.
Absolutely.
You get mad at the ump who squeezed the plate on Stan. That's fair because he didn't do his job well. And if you want to get mad at Jose because he botched a routine ground ball, that's within bounds as long as you keep it clean. But the guys who beat you, hey, they're doing their jobs. People in Pittsburgh should be honored that Sid Bream loves the area enough to still be there 30-some years later, 35 years, 37 years later after he got traded to the Pirates. He still wants to be there. That says a ton about your area. You should embrace him as one of your own.
I mean, even if you didn't want to be, you marry a girl from Pittsburgh, you're going to live in Pittsburgh. So, I'm just saying, it's interesting you brought up the umpire because there was 2 home plate umpires in that game. That was another tidbit that I thought was interesting. One of them kind of had to go to the hospital for extreme dizziness, in the middle of it.
Isn't there always something, like when you go back and look at these games where something fateful happened, right?
Yeah.
That there's these little weird things that seem to pop up that how many times has that happened in a game, let alone that, that kind of ball game, and it changes things, right? Probably on some level somewhere.
At least I'm going to think it did.
By the way, can we at least put to bed too, people here like to say Sid Bream was out. Sid Bream beat that throw by just a hair. And I asked Sid Bream about this, okay?
Oh, yeah.
I've asked Spanky about it.
Yeah.
We'll go head to head if you want.
Yeah, he said 100%, he felt he was safe, and of course that's the answer he's going to give. But that's what Sid told me. So
Well, Spanky says
I think he
unequivocally
just beat
out.
it.
So
Now, if in the article, what Mike told me, Mike LaValliere Spanky told me, was that when someone does a hook slide, that their lead leg naturally raises, because you're going into a base, so you're sort of sliding over the base, so that you don't basically, so you don't more or less break your ankle. That's why the technique was invented, or sprain it. And so you're sliding into the base and you're going a little bit elevated because you're still touching the bag because it's elevated. But home plate, if you do that, again, you're elevated. And man, I'm telling you, the photo illustration that we have accompanying the article, man, his foot's off the plate and Spanky's glove is on the trail leg. And so if this had been, again, 2022, not 1992, with all the cameras and the high def and replay as a rule, I think they'd have called him out. If you needed the right angle,
depending
but
on what was called on the field.
That's exactly what I was
We
going to
all
say.
know, like, if they called him
that's
out in the first place,
well,
they're
that's
not
a good
reversing
point.
it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, to Mike's point though, like, and I think like whatever that was called on the field would probably stand because it was that close. But there was in the playoff game last night, I think it was the Dodgers-Padres game, where they showed a camera view of second base on that caught stealing, that was so beautiful that I don't know if either of you saw it, but I mean, it was like this close up of second base and the hand coming in and the tag. And I'm like, man, have things gotten, like you try to look at that play now, well, not live, but the version of it, it's a little grainy. I mean, like, it just, things have come a long way in that regard, at least.
No question.
I don't know. Replay irritates me, so I'm just going to glaze past it. One more tidbit for me on this game, because I didn't remember this at all. Deion Sanders played in this game.
Yes. He
I
pitched ran.
completely forgot he was even on the Atlanta Braves at that time.
Crazy
Unbelievable.
stuff. Yeah, absolutely crazy. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. When did he do the whole played NFL game and then helicoptered in for a playoff game? That might have been a World Series game that he did that for on the same day. But
that was when he was with the Reds, I believe. But it's cool the way that his career intertwined with it a little bit, because at the time he was just already a folk hero in Atlanta. So pretty cool to see. But Mike, anything else that you learned from writing the story that you wanted to bring up before we move on to our next subject, which is related?
Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that, the other thing that, in addition to Bream, that really surprised me, because at the time, I was as I said, I was on my way out of town. We didn't have any newspapers publishing. The two daily newspapers were not publishing. So the information was somewhat limited. The Pittsburgh Tribune was had yet to really fully commit to covering the town. They did have an edition, but it wasn't really what it ultimately became, because they didn't have the full staff yet. So I had no awareness, really, for 30 years, that Doug Drabeck had tried very hard to stay in Pittsburgh. At the end of that time, and that the Pirates did talk to him, but basically at the end said, we'll move along. We don't want to we don't want to spend the money. And that, it didn't have to be as bad as it became, is what I didn't know. I knew that with Bond, we all knew Bonds was leaving, and we suspected Drabeck would too, because it was going to change. And we were right in judging the Pirates' intention, the management's intentions. But we didn't know that it didn't have to be that bad. I mean, Leland was staying. Some of the core was still there. With a player like Drabeck, I mean, I don't know that they would have won 96 games again, but they didn't have to fall off in the manner that they did.
No, they had a young Jeff King coming up, prepared to like kind of take over and jump into a star role. They had some players, and that's why
I think
Leland left. I mean, he's already been on the record about that. He felt like they weren't supporting the team, and he wasn't going to go through that again. And
I think it'd
went
be
off.
interesting too to look back at like the division at the time, and hey, there was very few playoff spots to be had, quite frankly, too. So those were probably factors as well. They pulled the cord a little early, but far different setup back then. I mean, you had teams winning 100 games sometimes that didn't make the playoffs. So it's brutal back then. It really was.
But don't forget, it was only 5 years that the Pirates almost won a division under 500, or maybe they would have had to get to 500 to win it.
The freak show in '97, yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. And we've got another potential freak show taking place right now in modern baseball with the Cleveland Guardians making a little bit of a run. So let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we're going to fast forward and touch on kind of what has become of the game at this point. All right, and welcome back to the Pirates Fan Forum here on DK Pittsburgh Sports Podcast Network. We're going to get into modern baseball now a little bit, and because 1992 we already talked about, kind of laid the foundation for where baseball's gotten to. And I see a lot of Pirate fans openly rooting for the Cleveland Guardians because they're not spending any money. They're taking on the mighty Yankees, and I get that. My heart's with that too. But I wonder what kind of a message that really would send this game that already doesn't care about these small market teams if a small market team pulls it off. All it is another team for them to point to say that it's fair.
Yes. Oh, I root for all the Dodgers and the Yankees to win every game now because I want them to get what they paid for, so to speak. Now, this is what they want baseball to be. They don't care about anybody that's outside the top 8 to 10 markets. So if somebody like Cleveland wins, they can say, "See, it's fine. Everything's good. You can do it." So it bothers me that they've allowed it to become this, and it bothers me on more than just the competitive level. I mean, that's obviously the biggest. I lived in Cincinnati for 18 years. Became attached to the Reds. I lived in Pittsburgh for 32. My heart went from when I was a kid was with the Pirates. And so there's 2 teams out of 30 and neither one has a shot. I think that's pretty ridiculous. It's 1/15 of the league and they have no shot. That's crazy. In compared to what it used to be, when I was growing up, the Big Red Machine, the Pirates 71, 79, the Big Red Machine in between, Baltimore being the team that the Pirates beat in both the World Series, and they won one in that sequence too. And those are the bottom markets that have no shot. Just is wrong. And so I the other level that it bothers me on is that economically, this is the worst deal for the baseball players at large that they could possibly get. But they get hoodwinked into thinking that if they adopt a salary cap system, that means they're going to make less money. Well, it might mean less money for Bryce Harper, but I think he could still get by on $250 million rather than $450 million. Meanwhile, you have teams like the Pirates with payrolls. I mean, my editor Bill Trocchi came up with this number while we were doing the story. The Pirates' payroll in 1992 was almost as big as it was this year. That's 30 years. They were in the 30s in terms of payroll in 1992.
And that doesn't even account for inflation.
They're still in the 30s.
That doesn't even account for inflation, does it?
No, that's real dollars. It was in the 30s. Yeah. And now it's like, I think this year was like 38. So it shows you what's wrong with baseball's economics is not just wrong for the competition, but it's wrong for the athletes. And they're buying it because the most powerful agents are selling it and have a significant control on what happens. And meanwhile, Dejan Kovacevic, whose site this is, has done the work and says NFL's basically 50% of revenue, NHL's basically 50% of revenue, NBA's basically 50% of revenue. Ballpark, give or take a smidge here or there.
Right.
Baseball, closer to 40.
Yep.
If you're a baseball player and accepting that deal, how foolish are you?
Yeah, well, if you're one of the ones negotiating it, you're rich beyond belief. So we looked at the board of players that are selected. It was like 5 of the 8 were Boris clients and making in the top 2% of the league. So
that's not. I think that happens by not by accident. Let's say.
Oh, I'm positive that it happens.
No, it's
not by accident.
Not at all. No, and if you remember, even in '97, we mentioned the freak show year. Pirates' payroll that year was $9 million. That is hard to fathom. But yeah. Albert Bell came to Pittsburgh for a series. I think he was with the White Sox, and he was making more than the entire Pirates team was at that time. Yeah. So the more things change, the more things stay the same, unfortunately.
I say all that about the Guardians, not because I don't like Terry Francona or respect him. I think he's awesome, and I think he's done a great job with his team. I even think they've built a very good team. And if it doesn't cost a lot of money to do so, and you're successful, who am I to begrudge you? But I'm just saying, careful what you wish for, because if they do win, it will be used. And it will be used as an example of why nothing's wrong. So just Absolutely. Know that's true. And if it happens, it happens.
Dejan also tweeted out a graphic that was put out by MLB to show the diversity of their champions. Like they've had X number, like, I don't know, maybe 15 different champions in 15 years or 14, whatever the number is.
That's their parody graphic.
My response to that is always, look, there may be a different club champion at the country club every year, but they're still all in the country club.
Yeah. And why should teams have to find different ways to survive and try to do it? Just because you might get lucky and do that or get close, why should teams have to try to do it? Why can't we have an even playing field? That's what I don't get the defenders of it.
Like I said the other night, I don't feel bad for the Pirates because I think on top of a bad system, they've got a bad owner. I feel bad for the teams like San Diego, who is doing everything more, really, if you really know their revenue stream. They're doing more than they technically can afford, and they've stretched their belts for about 5 years now. It's going to come to an end. They're not going to be able to do it forever. You're going to start to see them have to sell off. And they're never going to top the Dodgers. They're just never going to. Even right now, they may win this series. Look at the talent gap on the field.
Yep.
Look at the difference.
That's what really stands out to me too, guys, is when I watch these games and we look at a team like the Pirates who are trying to get a rebuild, finished, if you will. Just the talent disparity that is still there and the caliber of baseball that is being played by these postseason teams and how far a team like the Pirates still have to go, even now.
Yeah.
And
the Reds depressing. Are a great example, though. You talked about you've had 2 teams, Mike. The Reds tried, and they tried one more time to get something built around Joey Votto and that big contract they gave him, and they ran out of time and sold off again. I think early. I think they probably could have gone another year, but they went early. And, now, okay, they got some promising pitching coming back up and whatnot. It's not like I don't see the method to the madness. But it just sucks as a baseball fan. The next Hall of Fame player that plays his entire career in Cincinnati and or Pittsburgh besides Joey Votto, we'll never know. I don't know that there ever will be another one.
I think it was really telling that I did a tweet as the playoffs began, and I don't have now the exact numbers in front of me, but basically the top 4 seeds in MLB in this season were markets like 1, 2, 4, and 8, something like that. And in the NFL, it was something like 40 standing in for the Packers. I'm not going to, because I'm using Milwaukee to stand in for the Packers because Milwaukee's all in on the Packers. So
Right.
40 and like 28 and 32 and like 14 or something. I mean, it was like that. It was numbers similar to that. That's the difference between a system that's built on competitive balance and giving everybody an equal shot and saying you have to be smarter at football, not richer. You just have to be smarter at football and a little lucky. I mean, you can't have Le'Veon Bell get hurt every time you go in the playoffs, but you have to be smarter. And in baseball, you just have to be richer.
Absolutely true. What a note to end on. We got to give Mike DeCourcy props for taking time out of his schedule.
Yeah, man.
Right. This is a terrible time of the year for him to be giving a baseball show his time. So I really appreciate it. And any parting shots from you, sir?
Yeah, if anybody who listens and is interested, you can find the piece on the Pirates' Last Stand on my Twitter at TSN Mike or at sportingnews.com. It's not, it's interesting. I really do think it was cathartic to go through and do that piece, and I think you'll find it cathartic to read it. It brings back some difficult memories. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in the article that people will appreciate. And, I hope it doesn't I hope they don't avoid it because it's going to make them relive some tough memories, because I still think it's an interesting piece.
Absolutely. And I'll find it and retweet it on our site as well. So just to make sure everybody knows about it. Read Tim Benz as well. There's a ton of great quotes. I think we need to learn from history. And the more you understand about the history of something like that, the more you'll understand what's going on today and the differences and the problems that have taken place in this game in particular. So without further ado, Jim, everyone knows how to get a hold of you, brother. I'm not even going to make you do it this time.
I don't even care, man. I just want to listen to Mike.
Let's send it off to Ben. Do your job, brother.
Yes, your butt.